first phases that come out in any story that is told is the most important thing that you're going to have. Now, a lot of people would tell you that the most important part of a story is the ending. And while that's kind of true that the endings are important, because if you have a great story but the ending falls flat, then it kind of ruins the story for you. But in order to get to the ending first, you have to go through the beginning. And if your beginning is not grabbing, it's not engaging, it is not giving people something to want to keep reading, well, then they're not going to get to the ending most of the time. If you think about your favorite movies, I'm going to guess that you can probably recall the beginning of that movie pretty easily, right? Like if you go to watch Star Wars, the first thing that you see on the screen is the familiar words, "A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away." And as soon as those words disappear, you are hit with a trumpet blast of John Williams' score. After you get the text crawl, you are immediately dropped into a space battle happening right now. You know nothing about this world or these characters or anything else that's going on, but you're watching. Right? You want to know what's going to happen. How did we get to this point? What's taking place here? It is so gripping because the beginning is so amazing. Or conversely, that's a very exciting beginning, but if you watch the beginning of The Godfather, and that screen is black after you get the title card, and the first words you hear is America Bonacelli saying, "I believe in America." And you are dropped in the middle of a conversation as he is pleading with Don Corleone for justice in an unjust world. You have no idea what's going on, but you're paying attention because there's clearly something awesome taking place. One of my favorite stories about that, though, is the cat that Marlon Brando is petting in the opening scene was not part of the movie. It was a stray that had wandered on set. Brando picked it up and just started petting it, and they said, "Action." I love that part. That's fantastic. But of course, also, if you're going to talk about movies that begin, I'm going to give you one of my personal favorites, Tommy Boy. I love Tommy Boy. I've told Mandy over and over again that when my time comes and my funeral hits, Hannah, you should probably know this too. Instead of having the video that shows all your pictures, I just want Tommy Boy played on a loop. It's much more representative of my life. But the very beginning, you see Tommy as a small child, and he's running late for the bus, and he eventually gets to where he just gets the cloud of exhaust from the bus, and it morphs into Chris Farley from there to show you that while he's gotten older, he has not gotten any more mature. The beginning of the story matters in whatever it is, whatever story you're about to take place in. Like if you're writing a book, most of the time people are going to give you a few pages, at most maybe a chapter or two, before they decide if they're going to continue on reading. If you have nothing of interest, I'm not going to invest the time to continue reading that book. Okay, I will, because we've talked about that already, but most people will just toss it aside because your beginning has not grabbed them. If you're making a movie, it's generally accepted people will give you about 10 to 20 minutes before they've decided to either turn the movie off, leave the theater, or just play on their phone instead. For television shows, folks might give you an episode, maybe two, before they decide if they're going to continue on. As a public speaker, it's generally accepted that I only have about a few minutes to really get your attention. If I don't have your attention by about now, then you've already decided you're going to tune me out entirely. You're thinking about what you're getting for lunch afterwards. Maybe you're making out a grocery list, or you're doodling on your sermon notes. If you're one of the folks watching on the live stream, maybe you decided to go do some laundry. But that's the thing, is that when something doesn't grab you at the very beginning of it, you're not going to see it all the way through. So if you're going to start a story, it kind of makes sense that you want to give us some information about the main character. You want to tell us a little bit about who that person is and give us some idea of who they might be or what are some of their characteristics to get us interested in finding out more about them. If you're somebody who's going to be telling this story, you want to give us a little background, reveal part of who they are that'll make your reader or your listener want to continue on with what this story has to give. So it's important in storytelling to let your audience know a few things about your main focus before they have a chance to lose interest in that person. And I think Moses understood that. As Moses sat down to pen the book of Genesis, Moses understood that introducing the main character and telling about that person or that entity is going to be hugely important. In fact, the word Genesis itself, if you didn't know, it actually means origins or even beginnings. Meaning that that's exactly where everything is going to start. It's the starting point of everything. And so when we call a book Genesis, we understand that we are talking about a beginning. And since this would be the definitive writing of not just the early days of creation itself, it would also be the earliest writings about God himself, Moses does not pull any punches in making sure that we are given a few things about God right away. And as we continue on through the creation of the world and everything in both the first and second chapters of Genesis, we are going to learn 4 truths about who God is. 4 things about God that we can learn just in the first chapter of the book. So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 1 today. We're going to start in verse 1. Feels like a good place to start. This is the very beginning of the Bible itself, and we see what we learn about God right away, because Genesis 1, verse 1 starts off, "In the beginning, God." Now understand, we are 4 words into the entirety of Scripture, and already Moses has given us a major fundamental truth about God. In 4 words, Moses has already given us a huge theological element to understanding who God is. You might be sitting there thinking, Bogue's off his rocker, dude, how can we learn anything about anybody in just 4 words? But let me ask you this. When we say the word beginning, what are we talking about? What is the term beginning? It is a marker of time. Right? When does the movie begin? At this time. When are you going to start making dinner? At this time. When we talk about beginning, we are talking about a marker of time. And in this particular instance, we are talking about the beginning. The very beginning of everything. And understand that so much of our lives is wrapped up around time. Right? You have a specific time that you were born. Doctors wrote down the moment that you first emerged into the world. Right? There is a time that you are going to be going to bed later tonight. I'm going to guess it's probably a pretty consistent time to every other day. Unless you're like me and kind of depends on what's going to happen at 4:30 this afternoon. I'm either going to go to bed early because I'm going to be crying, or I'm going to go to bed late because I'm so happy. Go Niners. But you have a consistent time that you usually eat your dinner. You have a consistent time that you do whatever else. Everything in your life revolves around time. And yet in the first 4 words, Moses points to us that before there was time, God. Before the first second ticked off of the very first clock, God was already present. This means, logically speaking, that God is outside of time. Understand, time is the constraint of our lives. Everything about our lives is constrained within time itself. Right? You're going to have a time that you were born, you're going to have a time that you died. There's going to be a time that we measure everything in our lives based around time. Ray, how old are you?
Too old in your estimation.
Okay, Ray is too old. But we measure how old, okay, I'll use me then. I'm almost 40 years old, right? That means that from the time I was born, almost 40 years now have passed. That is a marker of time. Everything about our lives is wrapped up in the concept of time. And so the idea that a being could be outside and removed from that is so hard for us to comprehend. To the point that some of you already are reaching for the ibuprofen. Because everything about your life is revolving around time. And so the idea that God could be separate from that is such a difficult thing for us to comprehend. It is such a huge truth for us. Because if everything in our lives and our reality revolves around time, then how could God possibly exist without that? Every part of our lives is revolving around time, and yet God is outside of that. Meaning that he cannot be influenced by time. We are 4 words in. And we have already learned something hugely important about who God is, because the very thing that influences every part of our lives does not affect God. That's wild. Moses has given us a foundational truth about God, and it is already mind-blowing enough to consider the idea that God is outside of time itself. And that's why I think that Peter kind of goes on to describe this a little bit more in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. He says, "But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and as 1,000 years is 1 day." Of course that's going to be true, because if you are unaffected by time, then time doesn't hold the same meaning for God that it holds for us. Right? Everything that we try to do to try to understand eternity is a very difficult thing for us to comprehend, because in eternity there is no time. There is no one element that we have to live with our entire lives. And so this becomes difficult for us to understand. And I think that, again, one of the reasons why it is so hard for us is because of how much of an influence time is in our lives. And so one of maybe the best descriptors of how God sees it, I don't know if it's the best, but it's the best I got for you today. But one of the best ones that I've ever heard came from C.S. Lewis, the great author and Christian, who I really hope we're not going to find out there was a scandal involving him this week. But C.S. Lewis described the way that God views time like this. Imagine we were to draw a timeline on the back of this paper, right? Like we were just going to mark a timeline of your life. You were born on such and such date. At this time you scraped your knee when you fell off your bike. At this time you met your spouse. At this time you had your first kid. At this time you had your first grandkid. You and I are going to read that timeline in order of events, because that's how we understand time itself. God is the paper. God sees all of time at once. He can see the scope of time itself because he is outside of time. And therefore, God is not beholden to the laws of time in the same way that you and I are. We are 4 words in. And already, our minds are completely blown because we are learning that God is outside of the constraint of our lives. Right? We say we wish we had more time. We say we wish that we started at a different time. We'll say that I want to eat at this time. We will say that everything about time continues to move. When somebody reaches the end of their lives, it's their time has come. Right? When things are boring to us, time seems to stand still because this sermon was just not going to stop. He won't move past the concept of time. Stop talking about time. We could spend years trying to dissect this and trying to understand it, and we would still not even come close to fully comprehending what it means that God is outside of time, that God is the paper, not the timeline. That is such a hard thing for us to wrap our brains around. And again, if Moses had stopped right there, if that was all he had to say about the character of God in the first sentence of the book, I mean, at least to me, that's going to be worth keeping going, right? But that first sentence is not done, because he concludes the verse by saying that God created the heavens and the earth. And once more, we are revealed something profound about the character of God. Because God, as his first act at the very beginning of time, as that first second passes on that first clock, God creates the heavens and the earth. Now, I don't know how you understand the concept of heavens and earth, but to me, it kind of means pretty much everything, right? The first act that God has on this earth is to create, to take nothing and create something from it. If you were to go outside, don't do it right now, wait until we're done. If you want to go outside, that's fine, I guess. You do you. But if you go outside and you go take a hike, you go look at some mountains, you go look at some trees, you go look at the night sky, all of that is created by God himself. Everything that we have discovered as humanity was created by God. Everything that we have yet to discover was created by God. That's mind-blowing, is it not? to think that God's very first act is to create absolutely everything. But this also means it reveals another part of God to us that I don't think we can ever really fully understand. We have ideas of this one a little bit more. But it means that God, as creator, is separate from his creation. Right? Here's why I say that's a little easier for us to understand. As human beings, we are naturally creative beings. Right? Yes, no, something. Yes, we are all naturally creative beings. Humanity has a whole history crafted into our creation and the ways that we create around us. Right? We are sculptors, we are painters, we are builders, we are designers, we are architects, we are insert creative thing here. Every single one of us creates something in some way, shape, or form. Even if you think I'm not that creative, if you go out and you can put two boards together, congratulations, you've created something. It's called a butt joint when you just put it together and you just do that. If you wanted to carve a little hole in this one, you could do that when it's called a lap joint. We're good. I don't want to get into too much woodworking today, even though I really want to go woodworking today. But understand that we are creative beings. This is part of our nature. It's part of our DNA to be creative. And so we can kind of understand the idea that God, as the creator, is separate from its creation. Right? A painter is not changed by his painting. The painting is changed by the painter. The sculptor is not shaped or molded by the sculpture itself. Rather, he is the one who does the sculpting. Like all good parents, a few years ago, Mandy and I introduced the girls to the incomparable work of one Mr. Bob Ross. If somehow, shape, or form you have no idea who Bob Ross is, first off, I'm sorry. But Bob Ross was a painter who taught painting through his television show. Right? He was one of the early stages of PBS. Was to create the joy of painting in his people. He had a love and a desire to paint, and he wanted to share that love with as wide an audience as he possibly could. So he created, in Muncie, Indiana, of all places, which, as an Indiana guy, why Muncie? Right? If you ever watch Parks and Recreation, Jerry on there says that Muncie, Indiana is his favorite city. Mandy and I refer to Muncie, Indiana as the pit of despair. Because we've been to Muncie. Anyway. But Bob Ross from Muncie, Indiana, wanted to create the joy of painting, and so he would take he oftentimes painted landscapes. That was primarily what he would do, because landscapes you can paint relatively quickly. He has 20 minutes. So there you go. But as we were watching with the girls, Bob Ross said something in one of the episodes that we were watching that I had never really considered before. He's painting a landscape of this one particular area, and he said in the midst of that episode, you know what, I'm going to put a tree right here, because I think a tree should go here, and since this is my world, a tree is going to go right here. I had never thought of the act of painting as essentially world building, but that's what it is. He is creating, as far as I know, a landscape of a place that doesn't exist, though it's influenced by places that do. And so he decides that a tree is going to go right here in the midst of his creation, because he can. Did I just compare God to Bob Ross? Or did I compare Bob Ross to God? Either way. But God, as this creator, is now separate from his creation. And the ways that he does it is far different. The way that God expresses his creativity is different than the way that we express ours. Right? For us, if we're going to be the ones to be creating anything, if we want to be creative in our lives, it is going to take time. I brought it all back. Look at that. Oh no, he's back on time. But it is. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort. It's going to take energy. It's going to take money. It's going to take resources. It's going to take time for us to be able to create. For God, however, in order to express his creativity, he only needed to speak. Because in the verses that follow, as we read the next several verses in the first chapter of Genesis, there is a theme that starts to take shape. God speaks, it happens. In verse 3, it says, God said, let there be light, and there was light. In verse 9, it says, then God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let dry land appear, and it was so. In verse 24, we read, "And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so." The power and the authority of God are on complete and utter display throughout this chapter. And if we really, really stop to consider this for just a moment, if we really stop to think about what this means, that God simply speaks and it is so, then this reveals to us the third element of who God is. That God is powerful. God is separate from this creation. He speaks these things into existence. We're not going to get into the minutiae today of how those things happened after he spoke. We're not going to talk old earth creation. We're not going to talk new earth creationism because we're still really early on in here and we got a lot more to go today, folks. But understand that if God is simply powerful enough to speak and things happen, that actually has some pretty terrifying connotations to it. Imagine that if there was a person in our midst who could do this very same thing. They could simply speak and things would happen. We'd be terrified of that person. Because if they're powerful enough to create something where there was nothing, that also implies that they can destroy simply by speaking. We would spend so much of our time in utter terror of the existence of that individual because they carry with them so much power to create or destroy. But understand, there is a being with that much power. Because we're reading about him in Genesis chapter 1. He is so powerful, he is so awe-inspiring that to simply speak out his words changes the fabric of everything. He is separate from his creation, meaning that he cannot be manipulated by that creation. It's one of the reasons why God is considered unchanging. It's because as the creator, he cannot be influenced by his creation. However, he can continue to influence his creation. He is not under the same elements as each and every one of us because he is the one who made those elements. The laws of physics and gravity and time and whatever else you can think of scientifically do not apply to God. Why? Because he made them. And a creator is not subject to his creation. And so it would be easy for us to look at this first chapter of Genesis and find ourselves terrified of God. Because if a being can have that much power, can be completely separate from its creation, and can even be separated from time itself, then there's a very real chance that he may not care about that creation. That he is indifferent to it. Right? If I as a woodworker don't like the way that the wood that I've been working with is shaping out to be, if something doesn't measure, okay, so let's talk about a really honest thing that happens all the time. If I measure wrong, then there's a very real chance if I've cut off too much, I've now made that wood worthless for the thing that I had designed it for. And I can either set it aside to maybe hope that it's useful somewhere down the line, or, as Mandy would probably wish I would do more often, I can burn it and destroy it and get rid of it because it is no longer useful to me. Not going to affect me one way or the other. Unless it's like a really cool piece of walnut or something, then I might be a little upset. But if God as creator is separate from all of these things, it would be easy for us to think that he is indifferent to that creation. However, as we read the rest of Genesis 1 and on into a little bit of Genesis 2, we are painted a very different picture. Because in Genesis chapter 1, verse 25, we read that as God has created everything, he says, and God saw that it was good. But as God looks at the entirety of this creation that he has made and sees that it is good, he comes to the understanding that something is missing. And in verse 26, we read, then God said, let us make man in our own image and our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and of the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. I love that the ESV translation says creeping thing that creeps on the earth. It struck me as funny when I read it. So, as God looked over the entire world that he made, he decided that this world needed mankind. It needed a more human element to it. But understand that everything else up in this creation narrative, up until this particular point, if God decided that the world needed it, he simply spoke to it and it happened. But he had something different in mind when it came to the creation of humanity. And in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, we are given a little bit more of what this picture is. Because it says, "Then God formed the man out of the dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living creature." Unlike everything else that God had created up to this point, God, in essence, took his time when it came to creating man. God is powerful enough, he could have simply said, "Let there be man," and there would be man, right? If God is powerful enough to say, "Let there be this," and there is this, there's darkness, let there be light, there's suddenly light. That's crazy. God said, "Let there be beasts that roam the earth," meaning that there's more life to be created. Understand that the animals are complex creatures, right? Similar to us, they've got working brains, they've got nervous systems, they've got lungs, they've got all these different elements that have to make up that individual. God spoke complex ecosystems into existence. Ecosystems that only function a certain way, and if something is slightly off, it ruins the whole thing. He spoke all of that into existence. He could have very easily said, "Let there be man," and there's a man. That's the sound it would make too. But instead, God did something different. And it's a beautiful picture, I think, if you really stop to think about it, that the God of the universe, the all-powerful, the one who is separate from his creation, the one who is separate from time, decides to gather things up and to shape it and to mold it, making sure that every part is in the right spot. Making sure that everything that he has in mind is coming out exactly the way that he wants to. And I always like to picture it this way. I don't know, this is just me. That as God finishes forming that last little bit, he kind of stands back. He goes, "Yeah, that's it." And then he does something that is so beautifully intimate. Because God takes the very breath that he had just used to create everything else in this universe, and he breathes that breath into the nostrils of this man to give him life. And I use that word intimate very purposefully, because what this particular part of the whole creation narrative shows us is that God, while he is separate from time, while he is separate from his creation and cannot be influenced by his creation, and while he is all-powerful, he is also deeply personal. God would love this creation so very much that he would take his time in its creation, making sure that molding it by hand himself, and then breathing his own breath to give it life for the very first time. This means that every single person that you have ever met in your life, and every person that you have yet to meet in your life, is endowed within themselves the very breath of life from God himself. I firmly believe that this is what gives us as humanity. This is what we mean when we say that life is sacred. Because every individual carries within them the breath of God himself. Because God wanted a relationship with you so much so that he was willing to endow you with his very own breath. Right? God is not impersonal. He is not impartial. He is not uncaring. Any creative person who makes something by nature is going to at least care a little bit about what it is that they have made. If I ever make something for you from woodworking and stuff, we're going to have a moment whenever I go to deliver it to you where I'm going to teach you, here's how you take care of this. Here's the cleaning stuff that you should use on this. But then I'm going to tell you I have a taillight policy, and once I leave, it's your problem now. So if it breaks 5 minutes afterwards, it won't. I probably stood on it. But anyway, but this is the thing, is that it's impossible to spend that kind of time creating something and not care about it, at least to some level. And so the idea that God could ever not care about us, when he formed us from the dust of the earth itself and breathed life into us on his own, it doesn't get much more personal than that. But God would go on to continue to care about us beyond all of that. Because again, while we're focused on the Old Testament this year, we have to recognize that John 1 verse 14 reminds us that God himself would come to this earth ultimately to save us when it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and full of truth. Yes, God is outside of time. Yes, God is separate from his creation, unable to be influenced by it. And yes, he is more powerful than we could ever hope to understand. We think we know power. We think we know power because we've got power for all of our political leaders. We know the power of someone who is able to use their words to manipulate others to do their bidding, good or evil. Or even more, we think we know about power simply from physical strength itself. We have no idea of power because true power belongs to God. And yes, while all of this is true, God is also personal. He wants individual connection with you because you are his creation. And you carry within yourself the life-bringing breath of God. It is part of your makeup as a human being. And only when God had created man did he look at the entirety of what he had made. And as the first part of Genesis chapter 1 verse 31 tells us, and we will close with it today, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good.